Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Bobby Jones, and today's interview is the first in a two-part discussion, and it's going to be focused on CRNA education, AA&A changes, and the evolving landscape of healthcare. So enjoy. Welcome to the Plan B CRNA podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Jones, and I'm so excited that you're here. The Plan B CRNA podcast is the only show made specifically for nurse anesthetists who are exploring options outside of their traditional career paths. This is the place to expand your mind and your goals as we uncover new ways to produce side income together. Join me for some honest, unscripted discussions with other CRNAs who are transforming their financial lives. This episode is brought to you by On-Call Capital. On-Call Capital is dedicated to educating CRNAs and other healthcare providers about investing outside of the traditional stock market. On-Call Capital also provides opportunities for you, yes, you, to create passive income and generational wealth while also lowering your taxable income through investments in the apartment and alternative investment spaces. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure you do that right now so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me today, and now on with the show. Welcome to another Provider Spotlight episode of the Plan B CRNA podcast. My guest today really is a jack of all trades as a healthcare provider, pilot, and investor. Erin Conklin is a CRNA who has 4 years of level 1 trauma experience in New York City, and he's currently beginning his 1099 journey. He's also written 300 pages of unpublished information regarding bariatric surgery, which has become an increasingly relevant anesthesia topic. Eric has been successfully trading stocks, options, and cryptocurrency since 2018, doing extensive research on the American economy. He's here today to discuss CRNA education, the American healthcare system, and developing multiple income streams within the complex marketplace. Welcome to the show today, Eric.
Hey, Bobby. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. It's a pleasure to have you. So, I want to start off with the topic of CRNA education. You know, I went to school from 2009 to 2011, and education was, really getting you ready to practice anesthesia. And our program was pretty advanced. They explored some topics regarding the business of anesthesia, but it was still kind of like drinking fire from, or drinking water from a fire hose, I should say. Yeah. Don't drink fire. That's not a good idea. But you were in school, nearly a decade later. So what did you see during your time when you were in school?
Sure. Yeah. We did touch on the business aspect, and it was great. Our program director had us do some exercises towards the end of our training to just show the CRNA's worth and what kind of revenue they could generate while they're in the OR. Sans all the equipment and the staff that needs to be paid for, but they did focus on knowing our value. And along with that, in the education, they really did push, because one of the few things that seemed to be kind of, for lack of a better term, gatekept by the anesthesiologist were the regional skills. And so at the end of the program, he bought us 2 days with, I think it was Block Buddy or one of those services of folks that came and did ultrasound and really got us a lot of hands-on time. So overall, the education was geared toward the independent CRNA, and we had a handful of offsite rotations 6 weeks at a time that allowed myself and other students that participated in those to work with CRNAs in a CRNA-only practice in rural Pennsylvania. So I'm not sure if that mirrors similar to what you experienced, but he was, as a program director, I think he had only been in practice 3 years himself. So I think it was really good to see, and I think we got a really good education. From what I could see, going to conferences and talking to other students at the time, we were definitely a little bit further ahead than some maybe these larger academic institutions that have CRNAs kind of as a byproduct of their operation.
Well, I know, like, we're in this changing healthcare environment anyway. So, I mean, education always has to be evolving. And you mentioned that you're getting this education to be independent. I know our program director did the best that he could to provide that kind of experience by having multiple sites outside of our main campus that we went to get some of that regional experience and to get some of that independent experience. So, and I wonder what you think about how, figuring out how to be independent, learning how to be an independently practicing CRNA. How is that affecting the team model of anesthesia care? Do you see that evolving as well?
Yeah, that's a really big topic, and it's interesting you ask, because it's every day it comes up in my mind. And then recently, I listened to a few podcasts, and I had read some of the bigger cases about these TERFA infarctions and folks bringing the QTAM lawsuits against anesthesia practices that may or may not be supervising or directing, and you know, it's such a gray area that it's not really even worth discussion. But from my practice, I see that you know, some people want to be independent and some people don't, right? I think that's the first step, right? Knowing what you want. You know, there's a law of averages. There's going to be a 5% of people that fall into a certain category, right? So identifying that first, and then surrounding yourself with people, and just having, you know, you mentioned private pilot license, and a lot of what I do in any aspect is kind of just thinking it through, right? So imagining yourself in those roles, imagining yourself more and more independent, pretending, if you do work in a you know, a more handsy or more supervised model, or more directed model rather, and imagining that help is not there, right? Will you prepare your room differently? Will you have things in the room with you that you might not have if you knew you had backup? And so using that mentality, you know, it's about how you perceive the things. I don't think that the climate in general can address that situation, because everything is local, right? Even in New York City here, it's quite different from where I per diem in the past to where I work at the trauma center in terms of the level of involvement, because it's the practitioners that are around. You know, if there's an anesthesia residency and they're dealing with brand new folks who they need to, and then they don't see the folks different, right? They might know, but if it's a young attending or something, they might treat the CRNA the same way they treat a CA1, you know? So you have to take all those things into account. And it also takes time to gain people's trust and to gain your own confidence in being independent. And then you might not be at a place that allows you to be independent at all, you know, stricter policies, those kind of things.
Well, there's certainly an urban and rural divide there. You know, when it comes to practitioners, they're just fewer and farther between in these rural areas. So you do tend to have more of your independence in some of those areas. But you know, there's also the budding practices in these smaller offices as well that are popping up everywhere, even in larger cities. But they're running leaner models than the big hospital systems are. So it seems like there are a lot more opportunities for that independence that are coming along, at least from what I hear, you know. And I'm sure it is. It's got to depend on your location, you know, where you're at and what the established systems are and how those are changing. But yeah, I mean, being in New York City, I've never even been to New York, so I don't have, you know, everything that I know about New York is what I've seen in TV shows and all that kind of stuff. So it's, you know, I'm sure real life there is very different than my conception of it. But yeah, from what I've seen, just everybody, you know, is practicing differently in different places. So being able to kind of be a jack of all trades in that sense, you know, and having all those tools in your tool belt, I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's good. It's always good to be flexible. And I've been in the city on and off for probably the last 7 or 8 years. And in terms of the practice of medicine, and then now being in the realm of the CRNA, it was funny because 4 years ago when I interviewed at a large academic setting, you know, the chief anesthetist was telling me how they're really pushing for the team to do procedures, right? And how they had to sit down one of the clinicians, one of the CRNAs who refused or wasn't really interested in doing a CSE, and their sell is that we have to keep everyone's skills up, and if one person falls off the train, it kind of drags everyone else into that, you know, we're all grouped in as one, which is what I was taught. You know, you're not an individual, you're hey anesthesia, and when we do something wrong, we all look wrong, and so we've all have to keep that in. and then going to different other places where certain attendings, whether they're new or seasoned, may or may not expect the CRNA to have certain skills, and then running across a lot of other CRNAs with experience that they're not interested in regional, they're not interested in a plethora of things. So it's really the gamut, and it definitely, like I said, is kind of comes from you, and you kind of can create your thing, because depending on your scope of practice and your state, you can do anything you want as long as you communicate that with the folks you're working with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, that comes down to the education. If you're educated and you're able to do certain things, then you want to be able to do those things. You want to have the freedom and flexibility to be able to do them. But there's certainly areas where that scope of practice is shrunk down a little bit. And so figuring out how to keep those skills fresh, or how to refresh those skills if you're looking to move to a different area. That's why I think some of this continuing education stuff has really blossomed here in the last 5 years or so. It's been interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, because some of the programs are really spread out. I was fortunate enough to do the majority of my cases at one place, so the folks trusted me, they knew me. Same with the rest of my classmates. It was a pretty intimate program. But when you have people, for example, at Columbia, they have 30 different sites, right? And so they may never run into people more than once or twice throughout their time, and I think that limits it. So it's ultimately necessary for your continuing education after you get your feet on the ground to find those areas, right? You see those regional fellowships popping up. The ultrasound things are over there, and I know I heard folks talking about getting the business of anesthesia back in the AANA, and which I was always interested in, but I had never had a chance to go through.
Yeah, well, and I do think that business education is important. I think billing education, that's something that is really lacking, and I know they're working on that with the the state reimbursement specialists, and trying to get that figured out a little bit better, and educating people within the individual states about those kinds of topics. But I found, it makes sense the first time or two you listen to it, but you really have to kind of hear it over and over and over again for it to really start to click. At least I do. Some people get things right off the bat. I was never one of those students. It took a few times.
Well, we didn't have, like I said earlier, we did do the exercise on how much a CRNA can generate, say doing, a handful of lap choles every day for a week. And I took that a step further. And during the pandemic, I thought I'm going to have to branch out. I'm going to have to look around. And there were plenty of places advertising per unit jobs, right? And so I had to do a lot of investigative work myself to figure out, well, what was really fair. And I had an RVU book. Actually, we had the RVU books in our program, in our ORs. We had to do some of the coding preliminarily, for the front end, for the back end. So I was familiar with the book in my training program. And most folks, anesthesiologists and CRNAs, they're not really privy to, how the whole billing scheme works at all. And so I went ahead and, leaving out some of the details, but got in touch with some of the folks that linked me up through AANA that have done billing. And when I spoke to the guy on the phone that had years and years of billing experience, and said, hey, is this fair, right? What is customary in this market, for per unit basis? And it was not fair, right? And you don't know the payer mix of the people walking in the door, but you can estimate it, and you can look back, like when you're renting a place or buying a house, you can look at the utility bills from before, right? So you can that information is there, but it really is going to take a lot of legwork, right? And that's why I think there's so few people, that are willing to really educate themselves to this depth, because by the time you've done it, you've spent so much energy that it needs to be some sort of payoff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if the payoff is that you're not taking a job that you're going to be, underpaid at, then maybe that's your payoff. But yeah, you do want to see that kind of come to fruition where like, oh, well, hey, I did find that perfect position. And that may be hard to do depending on where you're at. But I do want to pivot just a little bit here. We've talked about CRNA education. You personally have written extensively about bariatric surgery. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on, what do you think CRNAs really have to contribute to the overall knowledge base of anesthesia care? Because it's something that, we see a lot of studies out there that are done by, physicians, and it seems like they have more time on their hands to do some of that research. But where do you see CRNAs providing value in the research realm?
I can't answer that question directly because I was never too interested in research myself. What I can say is that the literature that I came up with was more of a broad look at obesity in America, and then the treatment of obesity and how that compares to the rest of the world. And then, looking at the amount of GDP that is spent on our healthcare system for something that may be not really effective at curing the overall epidemic itself.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, how folks can contribute, the other thing that I can say is that, I see where I'm in a big academic institution. I see a lot of folks come in, and I hear a lot of the surgical residents and anesthesia folks talk about where they came from. And, a lot of times these folks need to take time off to do a year of research, right? And so right then and there, we as nurses, as CRNAs, we're at a disadvantage because those channels are already set up for the funding and for the folks that need time to spend before they're admitted into a residency program, of their choice. But I do know, John O'Donnell, for example, at the University of Pittsburgh, he's always publishing in the magazine, and I met him a few times, and I know that they're doing innovative things there, and I'm sure tons of different places all over the country. So I think it comes down to collaborating, right? And with any industry, the more communication that there is, so that like we're not all working on, if you really want to tackle something, then let's communicate and say, look, let's coordinate this study. So, the few times that I have had the discussion here at my position, and we do have the resources, and I've brought up different things. I said, hey, we should look at that, right? And it's just making that connection with the physician, right? Who, because we're in the position I'm at right now, we don't have an academic CRNA program, but we do have a huge academic medical doctor program, so making those connections and just using the resources that are available to you. But anyone can come up with, any kind of breakthrough or innovation. It doesn't have to have anything to do with your background.
Well, and I wonder how much, since the ANA's moved on to a doctoral entry to practice, that adds an extra year on. Not every doctoral degree is going to be research-based, but certainly plenty of them are. I wonder if that's going to contribute. And I wonder what you see as like some of the advantages and disadvantages of that move for that doctoral entry.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about the decision to move that way, and I haven't read enough about what the ANA really wanted. My take on it when I was finishing up, the programs were starting to phase out the 2 years. I actually did a 28-month program, and the folks that I probably shadowed about 50 ICU nurses in the past 2 years, and they're all kind of jaw on the floor. I have to do this for 3 years instead of 2. And we really haven't gotten into the discussion about why that is. And so, I had mentioned to you before, and I do feel very strongly about it is good. Back when I was an RN, I had an associate's degree. My first degree was in psychology. So I was happy with my skilled trade as a nurse. And then I knew I needed to get my BSN to reach the level of MSN and ultimately CRNA. And, I paid more for my BSN than I did for my RN. and I didn't get a ton out of my BSN. I carried over a lot of credits from my previous degree, but it felt like a lot of busy work, right? And it felt like a lot of unnecessary energy and economic energy put into this these letters and this document. And so that's kind of how I feel about the doctorate level education for CRNAs, because unfortunately, maybe fortunately, a double-edged sword, salaries have driven up over the past 5 years since I've been checking and keeping my finger on the pulse. And, sans the pandemic and maybe sans the folks retiring, you see 5,000 to 7,000 jobs posted online. And could it be that because these programs are keeping students in another year that, we're suffering a, shortage? But like I said, I can't answer directly why it's good. I'd like to think that it's always good to be in a room of folks who are highly educated, right? And in the operating room, it's a high stakes environment and everyone is very educated, and CRNA should follow suit, right? And so the AANA did that. So kudos to them for doing that. And I'm sure it's not, and I know it's not easy to add on. Now, because I've graduated and I haven't talked a ton, and actually the folks that shadow that are getting into the programs, and even my alumni who I've sent a few students to, I'm not sure what their extra year is going to entail, right? And so I can't say, and I don't think anyone will for a few years ahead, look back and say, well, what has it yielded us?
Well, and I think that's an interesting take, because I think there was a lot of controversy about that move. I think when you see other healthcare specialties, physical therapists and occupational therapists, speech therapists, all those, when, pharmacists, when they're all moving towards a doctoral entry to practice or have been doctoral entry to practice for several years, I can see how it's hard not to look at that and say, hey, we should actually be doing that too. But, I think part of that is because we were always kind of that best kept secret in healthcare, and that was that was a badge of honor, I think, amongst the CRNA community for a very long time. And, it was just kind of starting to change a little bit when I came into my career. And, I remember being a student, I had this crazy idea that, during one of the student sessions, that we should call ourselves wizards. And, we should have a doctorate with the acronym WZD. And I never really fleshed that out. It was really not a great idea. But the thought being that, like, we change our name. Like, if you go up to somebody and you say, hey, I'm going to be your wizard today, that's right. Like, what? You're going to, and all of a sudden you've got their full attention, and they're not going to forget who you were. Sure. But I laughed that off at the time, and so did everybody else. But, the idea of changing our name actually gained traction and swelled over time. And it's something that happened. And so, I was wondering what your thoughts were, why you think, that name change for the AANA was necessary, and how you've seen older and younger CRNAs handling that change.
Yeah, really good question. And I was just listening to some folks who are very well educated within the anesthesia community as nurse anesthetists, and discuss this name change. And, it's funny because I hardly ever tell my patients that I'm going to be their anesthetist. That's a difficult word for native English speakers, and it's a difficult word for second language English speakers, which is our primary population here. And I actually say that I'm a nurse with the anesthesia team. That's as best and simple as I can communicate it to folks. And as an aside, it's very difficult for people to not call me doctor, even after years and years and years of telling them that I'm Eric, the nurse, or the nurse anesthetist, or I'm a CRNA, or they may know, but they may still say, okay, doc, how's it going, doc? This kind of thing, just because I'm a male. And the folks that I work with, which is a small group, I don't know if they've adopted the nurse anesthesiologist term. I'd actually have to ask them, I think, because it's so new. But I think they'd probably smile at me and nod if I asked them if they're using that term. So yeah, I think, and it's confusing too, right? Because when you go to your PCP, and this was a bigger issue a few years back, I heard family members and friends, and they both were on different sides, right? I don't want to see my nurse practitioner, and I don't want to see my physician assistant. I want to see my doctor, right? And so there's arguments for both sides, and the name change, I think, goes along with kind of increasing awareness and making things easier. But I don't have a comment on it, and I don't think it was necessary to spend whatever money they spent on changing the name. But that's not my decision.
I don't know how much money they spent, but I took the idea as I thought it was genius in its simplicity. Let's put it that way, because I think, I can remember reading, research from in articles from Australia, and of course their physicians are known as anesthetists, and so the term is different depending on where you're at, and obviously the term anesthesiologist is somebody who studies anesthesia. So it makes sense. It's not taking the physician moniker. We still put nurse in front of it, but I thought it was kind of a genius way to increase that visibility while also keeping things simple. And I personally like the change. I think it's cool. I admittedly had trouble with it at first. But I've taken more of a shine to it in the last couple of years, and appreciate the ideas behind it.
I think it's definitely clearer, nurse, anesthesiologist, right? It's easier to say, it's easier to understand than nurse anesthetist. I think it also boils down to the fact that a lot of, and I don't know how much, I've heard this from probably 10% of the anesthesiologists that I work with, but I think that most of the anesthetists, nurse anesthesiologists would share the view that we're providing the same level of care. And so it doesn't really matter what we're calling ourselves, as long as we're not misleading the public or the patient about what our role is, then it's okay. And as long as it's making things simpler and it's adding value.
I agree with you there. Everyone has their own views on the topics of the day, and I enjoy exploring those views with different folks. And while there are certainly passions on each side of a particular anesthesia topic, I've found that most CRNAs are much like Eric. They're somewhere in the middle. The communication and collaboration that's required to support movements like the AANA name change or the doctoral entry to practice is pretty immense. And sometimes that change can be slow, but it does take hold over time. That's going to do it for the show. Make sure you listen in next week as my conversation with Eric turns to his efforts to establish diversified income streams. You can also find his contact info in the show notes if you're interested. This is Bobby Jones signing off. Be safe and take care of each other out there. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Plan B CRNA podcast. If you haven't already subscribed and reviewed the show, I'd be honored if you took the extra time. It really helps to expand our reach and get the word out about the show. If you're a CRNA who is interested in sharing your story on our podcast, I'd love to have you. Please email me at bobby@oncallinvestments.com for more information. This episode was brought to you by On-Call Capital. They are dedicated to helping providers like you develop passive income and generational wealth through investments in the apartment and alternative investment spaces. Feel free to check out their website at www.oncallinvestments.com and subscribe to their free educational email series. You can find On-Call Capital on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also check out our YouTube page, where you'll find all of the show episodes along with other educational videos. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.